Are you looking for an antidote to information overload? Well, at a time when the news cycle is moving faster than ever, The Week is here to help. Our new digital subscription includes a twice-daily digest of the day's most interesting, important stories, along with the liveliest comment and analysis delivered to your app or inbox. In just a few minutes, they'll get you up to speed and ready to face the world. And you'll get digital access to The Week magazine too. To get 6 weeks free and an extra 10% off a digital or print and digital subscription, head to theweek.com/offer and use the code SPRING24. That's SPRING24 at theweek.com/offer. Sale ends 6th of May. It's the week ending Saturday, the 20th of April, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen Iran attacking Israel with hundreds of drones and missiles, catastrophic flooding in Dubai after the worst rainfall there in 75 years, and Donald Trump becoming the first former US president to appear as a defendant in a criminal court. You can read all you need to know about everything that matters in The Week magazine, but we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team is Rebekah Evans and Jamie Timson, and we welcome back book reviews editor for the International Affairs Journal, Mariana Vieira. And Mariana, it's over to you first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Sudan war gets no more than a yearly reminder.
Women screaming, children crying, quite terrible images, to be honest, being inside that building. And you can imagine it's congested, like so many people. And then suddenly all the bags, people just threw their bags, so it's like nobody cared about their bags anymore. And even I left my bags there.
Dr. Bilal Khalil speaking to ABC News on Tuesday. Mariana, what part of the world was he talking about?
So he was talking about Sudan, and he was talking specifically about the civil war that broke out about a year ago, on April 15, 2023, which we marked the anniversary for this Monday.
The anniversary of the civil war in Sudan. And for those of us who haven't been noticing this story at all, which is why you've brought it to our attention, what's been going on there?
So last year, the country's two most powerful military forces have been embroiled in a civil conflict. So it's between the Sudan Armed Forces, who are headed by General al-Burhan, and the Rapid Support Forces, which are a paramilitary group led by a different general called the Gallo, or known as Hemeti. So it's largely considered to be a power struggle, which has taken place after another coup in 2021, and it has mainly come to a deadlock as of March this year.
So a power struggle, Jamie, what is it that each of these sides actually wants?
I mean, it's effectively about control of the government. So the Rapid Support Forces attempted to seize control last April. Then the Sudanese armed forces, so the military from Sudan, headed by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, stood firm. And then the conflict kind of quickly spread across the whole country, including Darfur, which kind of older listeners to this podcast will remember from 2003, where kind of famine and genocide raged, effectively due to kind of internecine violence between its Arab and Masalit ethnic groups. That kind of history has now resurfaced, not necessarily gone away, and there are grounds to believe that both sides now are committing possible war crimes according to the International Criminal Court, crimes against humanity and genocide in Darfur. So it's a pretty awful situation.
Yeah. Rebekah, what's been the impact of this conflict on civilians there?
Well, Dyer doesn't really begin to cover it, really. I mean, aside from the fighting, Sudan has been plunged into this major humanitarian crisis. About half of the country's population, that's around 25 million people, are believed to need assistance, and a lot of parts of the country have been pushed to the brink of famine. And I think that's particularly a problem because Sudan was already burdened with issues like a collapsing health system and widespread poverty and hunger. These issues have only been further exacerbated by this ongoing conflict. It's said to be the biggest displacement crisis globally. More than 8.6 million people have fled their homes, and previous conflicts have also displaced millions as well. Disease is rife. You're looking at issues like cholera, measles, malaria, and dengue fever. And also, obviously, the children that are being displaced as well are missing out on an education and facing all of these issues alongside the adults. So that's even before we address the casualties of direct fighting, which are in their thousands. So this is a really huge humanitarian issue which is perhaps not getting the kind of media coverage that you might expect from such a crisis.
What's the reason for that, Mariana, in your view? Because you can see coming out of Ukraine a general sense of, oh, we're not getting the coverage internationally that Israel-Gaza is getting. But I mean, many more people, it strikes me, outside of Africa, around the world, are aware of the Russia-Ukraine war than are perhaps aware of this. Why is that?
That's a really good question. And also, it makes it harder to sell the story as an undersell story, specifically this week, because if you'll notice, you have this uptake on news sort of talking about the anniversary specifically on Monday, but nothing else has been sort of talked about. The conflict sort of goes under the radar quite a bit. And I think it has to do with our positionality, right? I think it's very underreported in Western media because the geopolitical tensions and rivalries tend to be largely located outside of the West. So if you think about it, Sudan's strategic position is relevant in 4 regions, so the Horn of Africa, North Africa, the Sahel, and the Gulf. And it's mostly actors such as Russia and Iran who are eyeing Sudan's 500 miles of Red Sea coastline and have these naval ambitions. So the reporting, I would imagine, would be much higher for those countries. And you see lots of news in the Middle East Eye and Al Jazeera and so on. So different outlets, I would say. So in addition to that, you have the regional states who are also really interested in the conflict and also actively reporting and getting involved. And so you will notice that we sort of talked about the anniversary sort of on Monday in the news quite a bit. But I was only able to find out after reading a bit more that they're actually going to have a lot of peace talks happening today. So we don't actually know the outcome, but the US is brokering peace talks today. The numbers that Rebekah was talking about are so overwhelming that you sort of get a bit numb to it and have this sense of hopelessness in a way. And the other extent is that whether it's a geopolitical or geostrategic location of importance to the West, in which case it comes lower on the priorities when compared to the Ukraine on the border of Europe with Russia.
Yeah, that discrepancy is pronounced, though, isn't it, Jamie? You've got 19 million children out of school in Sudan, according to the UN. Nearly a third of the population is acutely food insecure. And yet, you know, you have MPs wearing the Ukrainian flags on their lapels. You have US students boycotting their college campuses over Gaza. Who's making a fuss about this?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think it is also to do with the amount of money that we're putting in. You know, the government isn't going to make a song and dance about areas and places that they're not pledging that much money towards. So, I mean, for an example, there's been £12 billion pledged to support Ukraine by the UK, whereas Sudan, the UK this week pledged $110 million. So, I mean, roughly about 80 odd million pounds. That's a massive differential. And probably if you're making a big song and dance about how much money you're giving to Ukraine, it does highlight the lack of money that's going to Sudan. So that's probably one thing. I think obviously as well as the money aspect of it, another issue is that I think people don't really see is that like 2 million people have been displaced across borders from Sudan, mainly into neighbouring countries. And as Mariana was saying, the kind of geopolitical effect of it is towards the north and potentially the Horn. But those people do have a knock-on effect to our understanding and experience of the kind of migration crisis that's happening at the moment. So, I mean, while it's easy to think that that is all going on down there is a route from Sudan and areas around it up into Europe and across to us that we could be more aware of. And certainly, you know, we've talked about on this program before lots of different ways of dealing with the migration crisis, but one of it is by helping the situations that are causing people to leave, you know, the push factors, as well as obviously tackling it when it gets a bit closer to home.
Internationally, Mariana, which actors are involved? I mean, is there a preferred side in this civil war that neighbouring countries want?
So I think there's been different changes on different sides throughout the last year. So as I was mentioning, there's, I think, 4 key regional states involved. So that would be Egypt, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and the UAE. So the rapid support forces have been largely aided by the other African states, such as Chad, Libya, and South Sudan. But then the army, so the Sudanese armed forces, have the strongest regional relationship with Egypt, so most significantly through the military. And then you have the other actors coming in. This is where it becomes a bit more complex. So Qatar and Turkey have also been involved on the army's side, helping generate revenue and through the sale of strategic commodities such as gold, livestock, and agricultural goods. So this goes back a little bit. From 2015 onwards, both sides have received money from Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and then subsequently, the Rapid Support Forces have strengthened their ties with the UAE. So this keeps changing a little bit, and I think more recently, and it was reported earlier this month, Iran is also getting a bit more involved. So Iran and Sudan had a more ongoing relationship under Sudan's former dictatorship. And then a senior army official recently told Reuters that Iranian-made armed drones have helped the army turn around the tide of the conflict.
So what do Iran want out of it? Is it just money for selling the drones, or is it influence in that region?
So that's really interesting because so far the army official was very explicit in saying that, and being unwilling to confirm that the drones came from Iran. So it's likely that they came from a previous collaboration within Sudan. So there isn't really a profit element to this, but it goes back to the point I made before about the coast on the Red Sea and having those aspirations for a naval strategic point, which are then also in competition with Russia. So I think there's a wider geopolitical race going on around Sudan.
Okay. Rebekah, is there any optimism here? Is there a way of seeing an end to this? And what of those peace talks that Mariana was mentioning?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard because even the Sudanese people and Sudanese individuals who are living overseas find it difficult to see whether there will be an actual end to this ongoing conflict. And I think that's all to do with messy diplomacy. I mean, as Mariana identifies, there are quite a few countries involved in this process, but the problem is that they all have their own agendas too, that they want to kind of impose upon the country, where they want to see the country go and the influence that they can have. I think if peace talks are to succeed, there needs to be a national consensus, there needs to be a compromise, a middle ground, but I think it's the responsibility of those outside nations to guide the conversation from a global perspective and offer their thoughts on the best way to negotiate, because we all know that the longer this war lasts, the more complications are likely to arise, both within the country and externally with those geopolitical parties. I think it's important for everyone to come together and just focus on the end outcome where we want this country to go, and obviously that is peace and no one having to die a needless death.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned migration, Jamie, earlier. Is that one of the ways in which European nations might suddenly find themselves part of this story in a way that they're perhaps not anticipating at the moment?
Yeah, I think so. I think we only have to look at the money that the EU is pledged into North Africa to try and deal with kind of boosting the economies of places like Libya and that side of things. The money that needs to go into these places to help. I mean, there was an article in the Telegraph from the Director General of the World Health Organization, Tedros Adhanom Ghebreyesus, who is one of the UN's overview. Is within his purview, and he was saying that actually first and foremost what needs to happen is that the humanitarian corridors need to be preserved, and we need to look at it kind of humanitarily, and that can only be done through funding and kind of outside forces taking charge in those areas. But yeah, as Rebekah said, obviously the peace talks are one part of it, but until there's a humanitarian corridor and these people are getting the support that they need, then we can start thinking about, what the next steps are in terms of migration and how it'll affect Europe.
And Mariana, Chatham House, where the journal you work for is based, has published research into the Sudanese civil war's connection to sesame oil. Is that right?
Yes, that is correct. So earlier this month, Chatham House published a research report on the sesame industry in both Ethiopia and Sudan. So both countries share a border. And the report is really good in highlighting this two-way street in which you can see how the contested access to land and economic resources continues to fuel and sustain the causes for conflict. But then once you're in conflict, you see how different actors and armed groups especially try to seize specifically or key strategic regions for the production of sesame oil. And in a way that those profits also create a strategic interest in maintaining the conflict or keeping the conflict going. So both Ethiopia and Sudan have ranked among the top 10 producers and exporters of sesame over the last decade. it accounts for 30% of Sudan's main agricultural exports. As our listeners might know, there was a civil war in Ethiopia 4 years ago, and Sudan used this to expand their control of the territory on this borderland, specifically called Al-Fashanga. So it's a major sesame producing region. So this civil war already had a sort of like additional interest for Sudan. And now that the different war is going on in Sudan, the different factions, so the different armed groups are trying to get a control over the region, to get access to the profits as well. And it's really sad to read about it because, in a way, there haven't been any formal agreements as to how the land was shared, but there was lots of informal collaboration across the border. And as the military has moved a little bit more into the region, they have seized land. They have not given any sort of compensation for it. They've sort of corroded the kind of collaboration that you have seen throughout the years. And they have built a lot of military outposts. The one upside, I would say, would be the construction of bridges, which facilitate access, because Sudan, on Sudan's side of the border, you sort of have to cross this river. And so, in a way, there's pros and cons, but you can see how sesame specifically is becoming a conflict economy crop.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because people think of crops at the centre of those kinds of turf wars as being drugs or illegal drugs or guns, but not really sesame.
Yeah, so absolutely, because we've talked about the impact of the war for Europe in terms of migration, but there's like this very fundamental way in which the war is disrupting the local lives for Sudanese and Ethiopian farmers, and also bringing it back to what Jamie said in the beginning, really reinforcing the ethnic fragmentation, and this is all around one crop. So imagine what sort of other impacts you have when you think about the wider dynamics.
Okay, Rebekah, you're up next after this. Are you looking for an antidote to information overload? Well, at a time when the news cycle is moving faster than ever, The Week is here to help. Our new digital subscription includes a twice-daily digest of the day's most interesting, important stories, along with the liveliest comment and analysis delivered to your app or inbox. In just a few minutes, they'll get you up to speed and ready to face the world. And you'll get digital access to The Week magazine too. To get 6 weeks free and an extra 10% off a digital or print and digital subscription, head to theweek.com/offer and use the code SPRING24. That's SPRING24 at theweek.com/offer. Sale ends 6th of May. Okay, Rebekah, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Is this the week we finally tackle the capital's homelessness problem, once and for all?
The situation as it stands is simply not compatible with the values Londoners hold. We're not set apart in this life, but stood together. We belong to the same community, same city, same human race. When we see another member suffer, we suffer. Making this right matters to Londoners. It matters to me. If I'm re-elected on May the 2nd as your mayor, my promise to Londoners is that I'll finally end rough sleeping in our city by 2030. Today,
London Mayor Sadiq Khan on Monday. Rebekah, in a mayoral election campaign, a lot of campaigning like that goes under the radar. So why have you picked out this speech as worthy of our attention?
Well, I think it's particularly interesting, this speech, given the fact that we are now so close to a London mayoral election. I think it's important because Mr. Khan has vowed to spend an extra £10 million on the issue, and that's quite a substantial amount when compared to his budget. I just wonder whether the homelessness crisis is something that will endure forever, or whether it is feasible to truly bring it to a close.
Well, how much of a problem is it in London at the moment against how it's been historically?
Well, a record number of people are sleeping on London streets currently. The latest data is from the Greater London Authority between October and December 2023, and that recorded that some 4,389 people are currently sleeping on the streets. That's a 23% increase on the same period in 2022. I think, even anecdotally, as a Londoner myself, going to the office in central London, I've seen rows of tents and sleeping bags and even old mattresses where people are sleeping in shop entrances or near green spaces. And I think in one of the richest cities in the world, where many people come for opportunities, this is quite stark. And for people who are perhaps not used to it, coming from other parts of the UK or even internationally, it might be a shock to see that London is grappling with this problem.
Well, Sadiq Khan, Jamie, obviously thinks that the electorate will care about this issue in much the same way Rebekah's just described, that they'll be walking around their city and thinking, I want to do something about this, as he was saying in that speech. Do you think that instinct is right? Is this an issue to bring to the fore just before the election?
Yeah, I think so. Certainly for his voters, I think it's an appeal to the base Labour support. It obviously comes within the context. I mean, he says that the polls show that he's neck and neck with Susan Hall, who's the Conservative candidate. Whether or not that's true and whether that's a bit of kind of expectation management, there's a bit of a discussion about, because by a lot of people's reckoning, he's actually on course to win a third term. I think what's interesting about this pledge is that he's tied it in with the national government. So while saying that he's pledged to eliminate homelessness by 2030, that's 2 years after his kind of third term, if he wins, ends, and he says that it needs another Labour government in order to achieve that goal. I mean, some of that, it does seem persuasive. You know, he talks about 1 in 4 of people who are homeless currently in the capital have been evicted from tenancy, and obviously we know about the Conservatives having struggled with pledging to get rid of no-fault evictions and yet not. I think there was a stat out on Thursday that showed, from Sky News, that showed that almost 1 million private renters have been handed no-fault evictions since the Conservative government promised to abolish them. So there are clearly some aspects of homelessness that is a national problem rather than a local problem. But I think that was something that was interesting to me, was that he wasn't saying this is something I can do by myself. He was saying this is something that actually needs to be addressed from a government perspective.
Which maybe pragmatically, Mariana, makes sense. You know, everyone's expecting that the general election will lead to a Labour government. That might not happen till January 2025, so then you've got to project forward 5 years and you've got to say that we'll do this by 2030. But surely part of that strategic thinking is to answer the obvious accusation that if you care about homelessness so much, why haven't you solved it already? You've been Mayor of London for 2 terms already. Why haven't you fixed the issue now?
That is the million-dollar question, but I would say that it's, for once, I think it's really hard to lay the blame squarely at the feet of one single politician when this is much more of a structural problem. I was reading how Policy Neat, the chief executive of Shelter, said that to end homelessness for good, it requires all political parties to commit to building up to 90,000 new social homes every year with rents tied to local income. So this is not the sort of thing that you can just come in once, have one policy fix the problem and then move on. People will always end up being in vulnerable positions due to the cost of living crisis and so other developments that come and go. And so it has to be an ongoing commitment to continue to tackle the issue that has to come from all the different levels. So it does have to come at the mayor level for the cities, but also at the national level, as Jamie was saying. And having just returned from San Francisco last week, I thought we had a problem in London, and then suddenly, for a city even richer than London, San Francisco does have a massive problem with massive encampments. And what really struck me was, it's not just that you need the willingness from the government to do something about it, but you also need it to not become normalized. And I think that the way in which the mayor, having London sort of emphasizing the need to tackle it, brings more awareness, versus when I was in San Francisco and you would ask at the receptionists whether it was a problem, whether there was some areas to be avoided. I was told that they are just harmless zombies and you can just walk around people. And this is super desensitizing. And I find that in a way that I know that the city has been trying to tackle the problem, that it is like other successes in the UK, especially in Manchester, for instance, really bring a bit more hope to the sort of pledges that you hear more constantly. At least it means that it's seen as an issue to be tackled versus something that you just are literally meant to pass by and ignore.
I mean, rough sleeping, Rebekah, is one thing. That's the thing that people see in the way that Mariana's described. But there's hidden homelessness too, isn't there? It's not just about who you can see on the street. Even if you solved rough sleeping, that doesn't necessarily solve these issues behind the scenes.
Well, yes, absolutely. As you correctly identify, there are the hidden homeless, the people who are not, your traditional people who are sleeping on the streets, or you might see in tents, for instance. But those who don't have a permanent fixed address, people who are moving from sofa to sofa, family's house or friend's house, that is a precarious state to live in as well. I think as Mariana and Jamie address, it's all to do with structural attitudes as much as it has to do with funding. It's about creating a society where everyone feels equal, as Khan has identified, but it's about more local governments and the national government working hand in hand to address these issues. And I think the kind of problem that we're facing right now is that the national government does have a very hardline stance towards rough sleeping. I mean, we have to look, we can look towards the government's flagship crime bill, which plans to give police more powers to move on rough sleepers who are deemed a nuisance. Suella Braverman also faced criticism earlier this year for suggesting that rough sleeping was a lifestyle choice. So there's all of these different aspects, I think, to consider. The rough sleepers who we see on the streets, but also a society that means that people can't have their own homes because they can't afford it or they've fallen on hard times. And that is a societal issue that needs to be addressed at large.
But there are people, obviously, out there, Jamie, which is why the Conservatives have put this in their criminal justice bill, who look around and feel threatened by homeless people on the street. Perhaps they see organised begging groups around where they live, where they can see people turning up and being dropped off, and they're thinking, well, these people are effectively slaves, really. They're slave labour. They're giving their money to a pimp who's putting them on the street. They're not, in that sense, quotes, real homeless people. That's something that should be dealt with because they're intimidating people at cash points or whatever. You can see why that can be a vote winner as well. We're going to clear up the streets.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people associate it with crime, and obviously tough on crime, like tough on the causes of crime, is a big vote winner kind of from elections all the way through. I think the thing that Mariana hit on that was like really resonates is about the normalization of homelessness and actually the kind of othering of these like mindless zombies as they were called in San Francisco. Once we accept that it's a part of society, which I think sadly has happened in London, it becomes so easy to be like, well, I'm not like them, like they just kind of almost deserve to be in that situation, and the kind of dehumanizing aspect of it, which is so horrendous. I think also people are forgetting that it wasn't so long ago that we managed to completely eradicate rough sleeping in London. In the March of COVID in 2020, of everyone in, and it was a scheme to temporarily house rough sleepers in self-contained accommodation during the first wave of the pandemic. The homelessness charity Crisis called it extraordinary. People congratulated the government on doing something about it, and then just let it go. So if the political will is there, it can be done, and quite quickly. And it's been a long time actually since I've talked about Jeremy Corbyn on this podcast, but one of his first his day one, if he had got in 2017, was to end homelessness, and that was a political will. And you're not hearing either side coming up with that kind of rhetoric at the moment.
So, Rebekah, what is Khan actually saying he'll do if he wins, which seems likely? I mean, what's he going to do with this money?
Well, City Hall is currently spending over £36 million a year on homelessness services, but Sadiq Khan plans to boost this by £10 million over the next 3 years. He also wants to double the number of these ending homelessness hubs that have popped up across the capital. By 2028, he hopes to be able to help at least 1,700 rough sleepers off the streets. And as well as pledging that money, he's also looking to change attitudes, as we've touched upon. He said it's time to reject the notion that homelessness is some natural, stubborn feature of modern life, and to condemn the scandal of rough sleeping to history for all time.
Mariana.
I was just thinking, if we combine Jamie's point on political will and what Rebekah was talking about, what to do with the money, I was looking at what other countries in Europe have done around homelessness and rough sleeping. And so if you look at the countries with the least number of people who are homeless, Finland specifically in 2022 had 794 people who were living on the streets. Their approach is considered a success within the EU standards because they have this housing first principle. uncomfortable, where offering a permanent roof to homeless individuals is the first step out of homelessness. So instead of focusing on like emergency hubs, which it seems like it's more of the approach in the UK. So maybe if Sadiq is listening to this and he wants some international based evidence or other options, here's some inspiration.
Okay, Jamie, you're up next after this. Okay, Jamie, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
This was the week we all ended up having to pay the Lycett fee for our news.
Right, let's get this out of the way. Last week, I announced that me and my team had planted a load of fake stories in the news. Did we see this? Yes. So basically, I wanted to take up space that they'd otherwise use spreading hate, misery, and pictures of Amanda Holden. So loads of you were guessing what the stories were in the papers, which were ours. And I can now reveal the answers. Which of the absolutely insane news stories out there in the last few weeks were real, and which ones we completely faked? So let's start with this one. A fluffy bobble hat was mistaken for a cute baby hedgehog. There's a lovely quote from someone at the rescue centre that said, "If this isn't a baby hedgehog, what the hell have I been breastfeeding?"
Joe Lycett doing his thing on Channel 4's Late Night Lycett last Friday. Jamie, why has this skit become a talking point this week?
Yeah, so it obviously aired last Friday and actually has kind of been in the background if you're permanently online, like some of us are. There's been a lot of stuff ever since he mentioned that he'd put these fake news articles out there. There'd been a lot of stuff talking about which ones they could possibly be.
Which, of course, was the intention.
Yeah.
I'm going to promote my new Channel 4 series by telling everyone I've planted some fake news. Can you guess what it is?
My favourite one was the Alan Titchmarsh censoring his trousers in North Korea, which if you haven't seen, you need to look up, because that wasn't fake news, but an incredible censorship job on his trousers. So, yes, this week, basically, there's been a backlash, Ollie. People have been upset, mainly journalists, hand-wringing about basically kind of, what the point of the joke was, apart from just to highlight kind of how funny or great Joe Lycett is and Channel 4 is, which, I mean, ultimately, is there a problem with that? He's a comedian, that's his job. It's a good question, but the kind of argument goes that obviously we're living in a world of disinformation and fake news, and by creating more fake news to highlight in inverted commas the amount of fake news that's out there, all he's done really is just made a kind of mockery of journalists and under-resourced newsrooms. So that was the main takeaway. The 4 stories. Do you want to know what the 4 stories are that he planted that were fake?
Go on.
A man who had a bruise that looked like Prince Harry, a Banksy that appeared in Birmingham, a study about men's penis sizes in the same city, but the only one that really kicked off was that the Welsh town of Cowbridge was putting up a statue of Ian H. Watkins from Steps, and that did get quite a lot of attention. So, yeah, I mean, it's basically, journalists are very upset about the way that he's gone about highlighting fake news, which I can see the arguments for. I think there's also a little bit too much of po-facedness going on.
Rebekah, you're a digital journalist. Are you upset?
You know what? I can see both sides of this. I think he's an entertainer and a comedian. It's essentially his job to be self-serving and draw attention to his brand. But at the same time, it did make me feel slightly uncomfortable, just based on the fact that I'm sure he probably intended it as a sort of kind of gotcha moment for the legacy media, often perceived as, a bunch of old guys with egos the size of the sun. But he's really targeted probably early 20s journalists who are just trying to keep their head down, meet their story quota, while probably not getting paid a lot of money. So he's sort of targeted an underclass of sorts in that respect, rather than the elite that he probably thought this prank would really stick it to.
Yeah, but I suppose, we're having that discussion. So, I mean, that's what satire does, isn't it? I mean, just because he doesn't spell out what the point is, if you can infer that one of the points is that there's lots of people in their early 20s being underpaid to create journalism, that's a good thing that then becomes part of the discourse, isn't it? Isn't that one of the things that he tries to do?
Yeah,
provoke those kind of discussions.
I suppose so. I mean, it's not his job or responsibility to do this kind of analytical deep dive into fake news and disinformation or the reasons behind it. It is his job to poke a bit of fun at it for entertainment purposes. But at the same time, this is very par for the course for the kind of tongue-in-cheek comedy that he's known for. So perhaps, hopefully, there are people who will interrogate this a bit further and think about the reasons behind it. But some people will just take it at face value and the comedic level that is the surface of this prank, really.
Okay, well, let's do that. Let's interrogate it a bit further. Mariana, is it a problem that if you send a PR story to a news journalist who's busy, they might take your word for it that a man has a bruise in the shape of Prince Harry and not independently verify that story because they might think, I've got to write another story about something really important, this is just a bit of fun? Is that a problem?
I think there's definitely something to be said about the content of the pranks, right? So fake news is a huge problem. It's the source of some of the most insidious conspiracy theories we have these days, such as QAnon. And I think in the way that to the extent that it has derailed really important conversations about vaccine uptake and climate change, it is a massive thing that needs to be tackled. I think that the fact that he picked, if I was to judge analytically, the fact that he picked stories that are slightly more lighthearted do allow for us to then have a discussion more about the actual state of the journalism, especially in the UK, versus the actual issues that are being talked about. So from the nature of those stories, I wouldn't say that he was trying to be taken seriously. I think we have yet to see whether it will have an impact on how people actually perceive and especially the level of trust that comes out as an outcome of the prank from the British public. But it also points to how there's other ways in which it might undermine the actual good research or investigative journalism that you have that is actually tackling misinformation. And you have stuff like Washington Post looking at how self-styled diet experts were exposing content that the World Health Organization actually thought was quite dangerous. And this also points to the way in which I think Rebekah was talking about legacy media, but also to the way that news are becoming more democratized and access to them as well, not just in newspapers as perhaps our parents would be more used to, but the fact that younger people are using the social media much more to get their information. This points to another issue of potential sources of fake news and misinformation and how they can be exploited, so that by having the prank, you sort of have a case study in which you can see how other formats and outlets can also be exploited. And hopefully it means that the kids are paying more attention to what it is that they're consuming as content and news on places such as TikTok.
Yeah, because one of the arguments for the legacy media, Jamie, is that it's away from the echo chamber of social media. That on social media, you can write something and it can travel all around the world without anyone verifying it. But in the legacy media, they do their fact-checking, and you can trust it if it comes from the BBC or, whatever, the Times or the Sun. And yet, in this case, they amplified a message that then got broadcast repeatedly on social media from users because they believed it was real because they'd seen it in the legacy media.
Yes, and I think the argument that you were posing to Rebekah earlier about, isn't this a kind of the purpose of satire is to highlight this stuff and it's not his fault if people aren't understanding it, I think only works if he's actually saying these are the reasons that I'm doing it, or but in that clip that we heard and even in the show itself, his joke is that all these legacy media organizations, all they write about are things like what Amanda Holden's doing. It's not asking people to think about the people behind it or why that is, or whether it's even the fact that, as a journalist, we know that the things that people click on are the things that people write about. It's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. But I think you have a point in the sense of it being on the BBC and being amplified by the BBC does kind of undermine that integrity that people have. I think to put my kind of po-faced cap on, if that's a phrase, I do think that there is a problem when there is such distrust in the media and most people are getting stuff from social media, that to then kick the kind of dog while it's down is actually quite dangerous. And, this stuff will be highlighted by people that want to tell you that the government controls the weather, like that this kind of stuff is so easy to do, to be like, well, look, the BBC got tricked before, so how do you know that the government isn't controlling the weather at the same time? So you do have to be really careful. He has a platform. He should know that this is a potential for this. But, I'm a bit conflicted, as Rebekah was saying as well, because I think it's funny. Some of it's funny.
Well, and some of it, I would argue, is news, whatever the intentions of why it was put out there. So, for example, one of the things he did, creating a fake Banksy and then opening the discussion about whether or not this was a Banksy in Birmingham, that was a wall in Birmingham that someone had defaced, and it was in the style of Banksy. So, I mean, the fact that it then turned out that it was Channel 4 that had paid for it doesn't mean that the news story asking, is this a Banksy, is exactly, that is the conversation people would have had as they walked past it. I mean, that is a thing that happened. I mean, what's the point there, Rebekah?
I agree, because I think there's a difference in how we view each of these stories. The Banksy one, as you suggest, I think is interesting. But the one that sprung to mind was the H from Steps. I believe he gave a quote to kind of add legitimacy to the story. So
he's just lying, basically.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think, if you've got a quote from the person that the story's about, why wouldn't you kind of take it at face value?
How much more interrogation should you do when a public figure is telling you that it's true?
I don't necessarily think that it's an excuse. I think, readers do deserve to read legitimate stories, and journalists do need to fact check. But you can see the kind of problems that some of these stories will bring up.
How bad is it to admit that I had no idea who this man was until I researched this story?
Oh, Joe Lycett definitely exists. I've met him.
That's yes. This is how unplugged I am from British news. So that when I was sort of researching this, I first had to get acquainted with individual and then with the show, and then I was just thinking, does it really matter why he decided, whether he had a good intention behind this or not? So usually, you know how you decide whether an action is morally good based on consequences or intentions or both. Then you decide. Then you're in ancient Greek philosophy and so on.
That's how we all interact with Channel 4 comedy shows.
Eventually. But in terms of whether he wanted to actually raise attention about misinformation, fake news, or whether his point was about the state of under-resourced journalism and younger journalists just trying to meet their daily quotas, I haven't heard him say any of this. All I know from now on is that he exists. He has a show, and it's become polemic and controversial because of this. So I have half a mind to actually go check it, and I think in a way it just ends up being very self-serving because we end up discussing it. So we do. It's up to us to then sort of have a discussion about the other elements around which we've had. But the fundamental fact is that we've just given this man free publicity about his show that I had no idea existed. And I don't think it's going to add anything to my life other than the very flashy jacket he was wearing on that clip.
Okay, but Jamie, why is this your story of the week?
Yeah, I mean, I obviously there's a kind of humorous element to it that means that when you look at it, it is obviously a massive, tragedy that H from Steps isn't getting a statue.
I see what you just did. You just did a pun on tragedy.
Yeah, how good's that, mate?
I mean, it took me a few seconds to get
I should be in your role. Just you wait. I wouldn't charge as much as you. I think that really the key aspect of it is how much journalism and news is under-resourced, and obviously it's a bit self-serving of me as a journalist to talk about a dying industry, but I do think more can be done for people to see that there's more than just the people working in these journalism, in these content farms are robots or drones or kind of like worthless in a way. I think there probably does need to be a kind of a longer discussion about where we're going as an industry, and this kind of stuff hopefully will start that debate, whether or not Joe Lycett is at the forefront of it or not.
I've got a terrible Steps pun in mind. It's all I've been thinking of the whole time you've been speaking is, can I somehow work in one for sorrow or last thing on my mind into my outro? But I actually can't.
7, 8.
I've been defeated. You can count me into the outro with that. My thanks to Rebekah Evans, Mariana Vieira, and Jamie Timson. Remember, you can follow this show for free. That's as easy as 5, 6, 7, 8. And get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. You can also get 6 free issues of The Week magazine with a trial subscription if you go to theweek.co.uk/subscribe. In the meantime, I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby. The producer, Ollie Peart at Rethink Audio. A statue of him surely coming soon. And until we meet again to unwrap next week, bye-bye.